Okay, thank you. We are so honored to have our next speaker, Dr. Kalama Niheu, a Native Hawaiian family physician, to speak to us today. Dr. Niheu is an associate medical director for COVID response at Lifelong Medical Care, which is a well-established, highly regarded community health center in the San Francisco East Bay area. She is co-founder of the Standing Rock Healers Council, the Mauna Medic Healers Hui, and a physician working to revitalize Native Hawaiian traditional kalo farming and food sovereignty. She will speak to us today about Indigenous healing and resistance in the era of climate change. Aloha.
Aloha Kalamaoka'aina ki'ia palikua na ko'olau ka papa moko hina. My name is Kalamaoka'aina Niheu. And I wanted to start this talk first with a mahalo to my ancestors and those who have come before me. Uhola ia ka makaloala, huai ke alohala, kuka ia ka haloala, pavehi mai na lehua, mai ka ho'oku ia ka halavaila. Mahalo e na kua, mahalo e na kupuna la ea, mahalo me ke alohala. So today, as in that oli, I lay out the makaloa mat, and I welcome you to join me to kuka to talk story about what I have really made the center of the work that I do in my life. The title of my talk today is Indigenous Healing and Resistance in an Era of Climate Change Crisis. Feels like almost a car crash of a variety of almost impossible things to fight against and to stand up for and to interconnect. But I think that that's kind of how my family has raised me, to believe in hope in times when it's hopeless, to be inspired during challenges and difficulty, and to believe that through it all, no matter how hard or how difficult, that no matter how big that Goliath is, that we can grab our pohaku and rise up. I do want to provide a little bit of content warning. It's like Gregory, Dr. Yes. Oh, are you not sure? Okay, all right. Let's see if we have this. Go back here. Thank you so much for helping out with that. Oh, you're the best. Technological difficulties are probably the worst. Is that working for everybody now? Okay, great. Wonderful. All right, and hopefully it's out there as well in the Zoom land as well. So let me just go ahead and bring on the trigger warning. I'm really proud of that photo. I took it, by the way. It's like I don't usually take nice photos. Hopefully it'll let me bring on to the next. There you go. Okay, so I do want to provide a content warning for everybody who is participating today. There is like Dr. Gregory Musgrinick said, I don't know how we can talk about trauma-informed care and compassion without bringing up the trauma. But I do want to be advised that in this presentation, I do describe and show images of police brutality and racism. I do try to focus on the beauty of our people in our community, but behind that beauty is always the shadow and specter of violence. Noam Chomsky said in 2016, all over the world, it's the indigenous communities, those who we call primitive who are trying to save those of us who we call enlightened from total disaster. So in this era of climate change crisis, those who will be the most impacted around the world are those who are contributing the least to climate change. So I am guilty, we're all guilty of eating burgers, meat, consuming more than we should, flying on airplanes, wearing clothes that's not necessarily 100%. We don't make them by hand and grow, the woke and pound it into kapa. But I think part of that that misdirection is part of them of us immobilizing our guilt, immobilizing us in guilt, because really what comes down to is 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. And these are a very small amount of people and organizations and policies that actually could be changed, and they're very doable to be changed, but they want us to feel like it's hopeless and that we can't speak out because we brush our hair with a plastic brush or because we eat steak. And that's something that I think is really important. I think it's really part of the work that I do is to try and challenge it, and also to remind ourselves that climate change is the greatest threat to public health right now. It's going to affect everyone. Of course, it's going to affect the poor, the indigenous, the people of color, countries that are not in the NATO groups. But it's primarily going to affect us. And I don't think I see anybody in this room that's going to be on that's spaceship to the sky with Bezos, right? So you can have all the fantasies you want. And it's weird because more people believe that they can identify with the billionaires of this world than they do with the houseless person that they see on the street, when you're much more likely, and particularly in Hawaii, when it's about 70 to 80% of us as maybe one paycheck away from houselessness, we're way closer to that person you see on the street than to becoming another Bezos. So I want to tell you a little bit of how I came to this place where I'm at. I think that sometimes when we see people out in the street who are doing these things, they think that, these people aren't human beings. Activism is a dirty word. Caring about the community and actually trying to do changes makes you a little crazy. And I think it's I think to myself, well, hopefully I can inspire you to be the good kind of crazy. Because when you accept the fact that you can't really impact the world in a meaningful way, then you give up a really important, beautiful part of yourself. When you're beaten down by the charts, the lack of sleep, the incredibly restrictive and oppressive structure that is medicine. Gregory once told me, he was my advisor in medical school, he said, medicine is the most highly stratified culture on the planet. Worse than places like India, when they look at people who, they talk about people who are the, unforgiven, the widows, the different strata. Everybody looks down their nose at, caste systems. But American Western medicine is very, very hierarchical. So I tell you a little bit about my history because none of us were born, fully formed. So my name comes from the struggle of Kalama Valley, and my family identifies this, and not everybody does, but many do in political anthropology and political history, as the Kalama Valley is the birthplace of the Hawaiian Renaissance. And so you can see here that my structure is a little bit off, but also giving a little bit of the history of the Waiahole Waikane struggle. This photo is in great gratitude to Ed Greavy, who is actually having, I believe this Friday, having his premiere of his art opening. So I encourage everybody to go see this. But my name means the light of the land, the torch of the land. And other people have defined it as those who know Olel Hawaii, there are multiple different ways you can interpret a name or words, is the fire that feeds us. Now, no pressure, right? I'm supposed to be the light of the land. My generation, I'm supposed to be nurturing everybody with fire and passion and power. Okay, well, you know what? There was a period of my life when I ran away to the East Coast because I didn't want that. It was too much pressure. I've been presenting from the age of 12 years old at international conferences about Indigenous rights, about climate change, about environmentalism. And it was a big burden, you know? So I ran away for a little while, but then I came back to this story of my parents who met on the rooftop of Kalama Valley in a struggle to fight and support the Kalama Valley community. Unfortunately, those of you who are Kalama Valley are aware that this local community of all farmers was destroyed. Everybody was evicted, homes were destroyed, all the farms were destroyed, and now it's kind of a Californian-like suburb where only the rich and wealthy can live, and majority of us can't afford to live there. But it was once a very humble farm. Those of you who are familiar with Waiahole and Waikane will know that it is a very humble place. And it's actually the kalo basket of Oahu. But it almost was another one of those almost private, almost gated, you know, upper middle class communities. But the lessons that were learned at Kalama Valley about the fact that we as Kanaka Maoli, as local people, deserve to be recognized as human beings. We were not just dirt. We didn't just have to work in their plantations. We didn't just have to take their minimum wage or less than minimum wage inhumane type of jobs. That we had a right to live with dignity and community. A lot of it started from Kalama Valley. And from that struggle, the fact that there was a strong, intact, organized, educated community, it's no surprise that the very first return of water that was stolen during the plantation era was actually returned to Waiahole. So Waiahole means the water of the ahole fish. For those of you, if you're aware of what the climate change has done here, is the theft of that water for the development of very destructive crops like pineapple, not for the benefit of the local community, for global export. That water was diverted and taken away from communities to feed, that fed themselves, that were self-sustainable, from the mountain to the sea. And that water was taken away in order to support those plantations. This is the first valley in Hawaii where it was, part of it was returned. And that's what we called Ho'iho'ikawai. And it came and it started from, primarily from Waiahole because of that strength of the community. It's since spread to, I think it's East Maui Irrigation Company, and also to Kauai and different places, continuing the struggle of the history of the law, which is that kalo farmers have the pertinent water rights. So I was raised in this. From this was this, my mom and my father were involved in Waiahole Waikane struggle, but then we also were a part of, during the Ho'iho'ikawai, we started the Onipa'ana Hui Kalo. And what that did was we revitalized and took kalo farming, and we identified kalo farmers from all the kapai'aina, all of Hawaii, and we helped bring them together in order to raise up our technology, our science. You know, people try to put culture into like a spiritual, you know, voodoo, like crystal waving thing. It's our science and technology, we spread it, and that's how come we're even in a place to can talk about Aipono, because one of the things that they did, for those of you who are familiar with the Waianae heart diet, the Molokai heart diet, heart study and the Waianae diet, is that people talked about the benefits of traditional Hawaiian food, but there was no kalo, because all had been destroyed in order to make the plantation waters. So part of this structure that I followed from there with recognizing each of the islands and honoring each of them as a kako'o. I became the physician. I started off as just a regular kid that helped out to return the waters, but then I became a physician. And it's been part of my life goal to bring healing into the communities, to not have them come into my clinic or come into my lectures or come into my hallowed sacred ivory towers, but to go into these spaces and work with folks. And the first thing I had to do, they knew me as a kid, but how they respected me was when I learned how to farm. And 80% of the time I farmed, I dug ditches, I opened waterways, I planted kalo, I harvested, I ku'i the kalo. And then 20% of the time I was talking about prevention, how to be safe, how to be careful, how to not get leptospirosis, and how to do preventative practices. And we helped about a few thousand people participate in these work days, and it started, and during that period of time, about 20 years, we never had a single serious injury because of and we had like 10-year-olds, and we're not gonna do it now, but we had 10-year-olds with machetes and chainsaws, and majority of the work was done by hand. And part of this mana'o that we learned and kind of got articulated was through the work that I did with Kalamaoka'aina, which was a gathering for Kanaka governance to discuss about what type of governments we're interested in participating in. And part of the education that we did was to talk about the kino, which is the body. This articulation actually was described by David Malo, which is one of our great historical scholars. It was published originally in 1853, but it described their oldest articulation of the kino Kalamaoka'aina, which is the body of the Hawaiian government and the perspective that it is. And on that turn, so the left arm was the Kalamaoka'aina, which is the governance part of it. The right arm was the kahuna, and unlike what they saw on the Brady Bunch, kahuna were people of special and secret, highly trained knowledge. Like, for example, we had healthcare providers that were specifically trained in a subspecialty of pediatrics before the PICO or the Antero-Fontenelle closed. Highly, highly specialized, scientific, massively educated, 20 years requirement of training in order to become a practitioner. That's what kahuna means, to be aware of that which is hidden. So we had kahuna on the right hand, Kalamaoka'aina the left, the right foot is the nakoa, the warriors, the left is the mahiai or lavai'a, those who would feed us. And the most recent articulation we actually talked about is actually including the manovai, which is the people who are the weavers, the interconnectors, both the storytellers, and those now we include in things like IT and social media. How are the people that weave our stories together and how they bring them together? And part of what we recognize, and this is a part of why I bring this into health, and why I think it's so important, is because so many times we talk about social determinants of health. But what happened is during our kingdom, because we were in the way of this global military industrial complex, they broke off each one of us from each other, broke the right arm from the left, broke the left foot from the right foot, and try to cut our people from the po'o, or the head, which is the aina. And when you talk about healing our community, how can you talk about it without talking about the fact that they fractured our body limb from them? And part of the healing that we have to try and do to be a part of that is to try to reconnect that and build all those things together, to know that it's not something that it's discrete and respected, each part, but it only can really work together if you move with all parts of the body. And if you lose one, there's compensation, and there's damage, and there's loss. So, fortunately, the formatting is a little bit odd, but what it says here is oil, water, and violence. And this is in reference to the Standing Rock and the organized Indigenous resistance to climate change in 2016. So what happened during this period of time, I've been very fortunate to have people in my life that have taught me to be both proud and rooted as a Kanaka Maoli, as well as a Korean and a Chinese person, for my ancestry, honoring all points, but also as an internationalist, to know that if somebody makes a struggle someplace else that impacts and resonates in me, that it's all connected. And I have many alliances with the Indigenous peoples of Mokuhonu, our Great Turtle Island. And when things started really heating up at Standing Rock, I had a great calling in my heart to be, it's like this calling, this poo, we call it the poo, the calling of the poo, where they're saying, come in, hele mai, we need the support of all of you. And as I talk a little bit about the organization we created, I think one of the things that resonated most deeply in me, and every day that I was there, despite the violence, despite the trauma, despite the horrible racism and injustice, was how do we create healing in times of war? Because make no doubt about it, Standing Rock was a war. And there were people on both sides of that, and there were people caught in the middle. And there are people like us who are healers. I feel we have an obligation to step out of our clinics and step out from behind our computers and our podiums, and to walk with our people wherever they are. In particular, into spaces and places where they are standing up for you and you and you. Healing is needed everywhere, particularly in places of violence. So one of the things that this idea that brought forward is really became known as the ceremony and the sacred, mini wachoni, water is life. The importance of the sacredness, the importance of ceremony in maintaining the health of a people. And they really pointed this out very clearly, is that if you poison the water from which everyone drinks, we all suffer. And if you poison it with fuel in this way, potentially millions of people will not be able to drink healthily. And yet, if you look at Standing Rock, I think the average income at that point was like, of that reservation was like something like $3,000 a year. This tiny little reservation in the middle of North Dakota became a lightning rod for so many people around the world to then stand up and speak out against climate change and the destruction that's, this imminent destruction, this existential crisis. This poverty-stricken community bore the brunt of it for all of you. To change the topic about green energy, conservation, and moving away from fossil fuels and divestment. This is where the spark happened, and it wasn't without a price. I was there and I took care of people who had their heads bashed in, who had their loss of eyes. They had violence inflicted upon them, not just on the front lines by pepper spray and mace and being pounded on the head and being pounded by LRADs, but also when they went into the hospitals to get treated for those injuries. Denial of care, refusal of service by healthcare providers, and incredibly very difficult, scary experiences. So just realized I have my mask still on. I'm gonna go ahead and take it off. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we created, which is the Standing Rock Manicure Council. And what happened was when I went there, I was invited, came as a guest, and I wanted to come there to help out and help be a supporter. And one of the things that when I was there, I realized is like, I'm the only one there that actually has been a clinical director of an organization and was able to utilize and create these systems. You know, I had been trained as a medical anthropologist as well as a physician, and also very deeply as a Kanaka Maoli and a Kiai or guardian. And so when I stepped into these places, I realized that I'm one of the few people in that particular space that knew how to like incorporate major supply chain issues, demands, infrastructure, creating protocols intertwined culturally as a guest in support of the community that was there, who were overwhelmed on the front lines. And I wasn't necessarily overwhelmed, but who were very occupied with focusing on the needs that were needed to be taken care of there. And I, as a supporter, could come in and provide some of this infrastructure for a functioning existing healing center. So a lot of people look at activism as a dirty word and they separate it out when it's really just people being conscientious and then people trying to portray them as wild, peripheral, marginalized, not somebody that's you or me. So a part of the pulling back the veil is that we had 1,000+ volunteers. During that time, we serviced approximately 80,000 people in 7 different camps. The largest was Ocheti Shakuin. We created an interdisciplinary global healing network comprised of physicians, traditional healers, herbalists, acupuncturists, massage therapy, midwifery, just to name a few. And each was and particularly in Ocheti Shakuin, we had 20 different structures within that. And it was small, some of them were tents, some of them were yurts, some of them were buses, depending upon what it was. But it was, everybody had their role. The physicians weren't above the traditional healers. The midwives had their own resources. The herbalists had their own space, and anybody who walked into the healing village could choose. There wasn't somebody doing a referral. They didn't ask for insurance. They could go into these spaces, and I, as a physician, did not dictate who walked into each of those spaces. So stepping into those spaces was, people always talk about, patient-centered care, a clinical home, but that's not their home. It's a scary, scary place, no matter how beautiful the art is or how gorgeous the spaces might be and how kind we might be. And if we have translators, it's still a terrifying place for many people who are in vulnerable communities. This was a place in their own space that they defined and were in control of. We provided very proactive public health prevention measures to allow for infrastructure, which became one of the largest populations in North Dakota at the time. So here we have this community, and we provided, part of that preventive care, of course, were things like how to survive in a tent in -60-degree weather throughout the winter, how to actually access care when you're getting beaten up by somebody is related to the doctor you're going to try and see the next day. But it was also things like plowing the areas where people would drive so they didn't die when they were driving around this field in the middle of winter. So these very connecting the dots between what public health care is and not being elitist and thinking that that's not our role, but actually providing the services that the people needed. So after that happened, we actually had a period of time of about a year where we actually helped support people from Standing Rock. Many of them were traumatized, who ended up going back to places all over the globe, help provide additional behavioral health services, help with housing, supportive care, connecting them with services back home after experiencing a terribly traumatic, injuries, And so it wasn't just this flash in the pan. It was very organized, very intentional, and it was very difficult. It was hard. But we learned so much. I went there as not just like somebody would try, I'm going to organize everybody and save you. No, I came there as a hamana or a student. And when we started talking about protecting Mauna Kea, in 2017 on Maui and Haleakala, we had some kia'i there who stood in front of a, the convoy trying to get up to the peak. And during that time, one of the kia'i named Prayas was taken and violently thrown down to the ground in a very similar case to like George Floyd was. Multiple people on him, on his back, knee to neck, dropped headfirst onto asphalt, and refusal to allow anybody to provide care. Does anybody remember that? Did anybody see that on Facebook? That happened just like George Floyd. We were able to intervene, but I know a lot of you guys are like in medical school and it's difficult at that time. But that happened in front of thousands of people who witnessed people that we knew. And we couldn't get them to step in to provide care. And luckily, Kai survived, but he has permanent neurological damage. So part of this was the impetus for us to create the Mountain Healers Hui, to help provide, to bring the lessons we learned from Standing Rock and to also bring it to Mauna Kea. So in 2019, we had another standoff, and at this particular case, I'm not going to go into the pros and cons, but I do want to just point out that people talk about, I respect science, I respect culture. It's like, hey, there's something very wrong when science is considered to be separate from culture. It's a lie, for one thing. But secondarily, it's also something that's part of the reason why we're failing at convincing people to get vaccinated. And we're failing to convince people that they can actually get their pain treated and they're dying of an opioid crisis. It's because we have yielded the field to the crazies, the anti-vaxxers, and the people that, we've yielded the field because we don't go out in the community and talk to people because, science is separate from people, right? So in this space, that's here, you can see me over here. We had a pretty long standoff. I don't actually know, I don't know if it's there. Actually, to the left, my mother was there. She's almost 80 years old on Coumadin. And if you can see here, the police officers in the background, they kept this for a while, and people were so sweet. They're trying to provide us with wonderful gifts and support with food. And, as our kupuna were lining the front road in order to block the construction of this mountain. And people were giving donuts. And this is me bringing out the donuts because we eventually moved over to Aipono only. And I pulled out the donuts. I said, mahalo to all of our ohana who's helping support us and giving so much when they have so little. But, we don't want to have donuts here because this is diabetes in a box. Right? So here we are. They're all laughing at me. One of our kupuna took that picture of me, holding up a donut saying, this is diabetes in a box. And everybody laughed, and they laughed because, part of what I was doing was there as being a person there that listened to their stories, was walking with them in their life, was trying to calm them down when they're literally surrounded by hundreds of police officers with billy clubs, mace, ready to step in and at any time hurt our kupuna. The Hawaii police officers, they ended up leaving, and they brought in the Maui police officers who were the ones who were part of that violence on Maui. And so in the middle of this, people are having panic attacks, people have COPD, they have oxygen. I was there just to provide us advocacy for our kupuna. And there were times when their ambulances came that I had to force them to stop arresting people because people were having medical crises. And I came there as a physician, and I stood there and I said, I want everybody here to know that this man, this kupuna, is not able to breathe right now. And they're so focused on arresting this other person, they won't allow us to provide medical care and get him to an ambulance. So here's a situation, you know, if I wasn't there and I wasn't walking with the people, I think there were a lot worse would have happened. And at Standing Rock, Mauna Kea, remarkable. If you have a city the size of 20,000 people, you're going to have deaths, you're going to have injuries, you're going to have problems. Standing Rock, we had only one. And that was somebody that took their own life, unfortunately. And Mauna Kea, and one of very harsh conditions as well, nobody died. No major injuries. And they definitely could have happened. So part of it, what we did is we focused on this public health perspective of AI education, AI meaning, you know, the kind of our breath of life. It's not just education, but what is it that we actually teach people that actually moves them, that brings them health? Preparation, so being very proactive about our preparation. And then like for these things, these are examples of some of the public education materials that we provided. We also had a social media campaign, we had videos, and we just disseminated a bunch of information about sun exposure awareness, hypothermia, Hawaii. You can die of hypothermia, certainly in Hawaii, particularly at the summit, pepper spray and tear gas awareness, altitude sickness, which is pretty serious up there and has, you know, if we weren't really proactive about doing what we're doing, it could have been some bad stuff that have not just from us. I mean, there were tourists up there that we were saving too, you know, so it's enough, especially if you have coexisting medical conditions or you're a very young infant. We outlawed, not really. We kapu'd less than 2 years old on the Mauna because they shouldn't be up at that height. And I think it's really important to connect it into, again, where is this climate change coming from? And part of the argument that we had on Mauna Kea and continue to have on this day is what is the risk to the aquifer? What is the risk for the water supply for an entire island when they're putting chemicals and tanks up above where the water like trickles down for the entire island? And so same type of arguments that we've had out there about Red Hill for a long time. And now it's hitting the fan, right? We even got the Washington Post talking about it. And the aquifer to an island, you destroy that, you destroy it for generations. The jet fuel gets into all the aquifers of our island. What will you drink? The upstream for all of us is the aquifer. So here we have, again, Kanaka Maoli on some of these front lines. Again, some of the folks who have the highest rates of health inequity, tremendously disproportionately represented in our houses, communities, and our incarcerated in our jails. Some of the worst health statistics. Again, standing up for you and your children, your cousin, and the tourist who comes in and, you know, rides our ATV on the sacred land. You too, because you drink the water, right? And it's also within this, connecting it within, you know, hey, people are angry. Why do they not trust people? Why do they not want to give you take the vaccines when the same person who ordered their grandparents to possibly to get arrested and brought the billy clubs, ordered them to bring the billy clubs and the mace, then next day says, hey, you need to take, you know, vaccines and follow public health measures. So in August 2020, while 62% of Hawaii was vaccinated, only 40% of Kanaka Maoli received vaccines. Shocking? Not at all. You can see the same data replicated all over the world. You can see it in, you know, African American Native folks. That was during that period of time. And then you also see it in places across the globe where they're afraid of what the United States is going to bring. They have who are righteously, truly, and understandably suspicious of a gift that is being put out by people who are, you know, this history of blood diamonds and lithium and exploitation and sex trafficking, and who build palaces in Europe while on the bones of, you know, the exploited. So here we have a situation where if you have a group of people, about 60% of the population is not vaccinated, you have a public health crisis. You can't have that. So injustice, it hurts us first, but it really does hurt us all. So here we have this is one of the data that we get from Atlantic, looking at Hawaii. Native Hawaiians percentage of the population, 10%. Okay, that's a little arguable, but they include in the data of percentage of cases, 41% of the cases of COVID, and percentage of deaths, 32% of deaths. 3 times, right, according to this data. Asians as well, you see, not as high, but 38% of the population and 57% of the deaths. As far as hospitalizations goes, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are 50% hospitalizations. So take home that I would have for you is to realize that, all of us, like Cheryl said, you don't have to do everything. You don't have to take up my cause. You don't have to take up Cheryl's. You don't have to take up these different causes, but I do think that you should find the fire that feeds you. Mahalo nui. Anybody has questions? If we have time for questions. Bring this back to the first one. You're welcome.
Does anybody have questions here? I think Corey Joe can read some questions from the chat. Corey Joe, are you there?
Awesome. Thank you for the talk. I was curious about, you mentioned the Standing Rock medic, and I forget what the second part was.
Medic healer.
Yeah. And, I was just kind of curious more about entering communities that aren't your own,
Yes.
Especially in, I'm not exactly sure the timeline, but from what I recall in Standing Rock, it was something that kind of flared up, relatively quickly in the national consciousness, I guess. And so I'm just saying that to say that it was kind of an acute situation, and how you enter that community that rapidly and reconcile with that, I guess. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. I think that's an incredibly important question, especially when you're doing advocacy in communities that have very good reason to not trust people. And part of the work that I'm currently writing on talks about the violence of entry and exit, in which when you enter, and this is something that I really saw at Standing Rock, because you had about 100,000 people go through this tiny little community, and I think all of them were well-intentioned. I think I was well-intentioned. I think the volunteers that we had were well-intentioned. We had brought good skills, but we still hurt people, and we still hurt that place. What I try to do was, in the long run, I have great gratitude to Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, Linda Black Elk, Dr. Rupa Maria, who helped us from the beginning envision the Mini-Wachoni Clinic, which is actually coming to fruition here. So whenever my family taught me as a guest, the number one thing about being a guest is when you enter a community, it should be better than when you left it. Even then, the violence of entry and exit doesn't matter. It doesn't have to do with me being a good person. It's that when people who are really vulnerable, like for example, our houseless population, when you enter into their spaces, we have such little control. Any change is usually one of violence. So when people come in and they enter that space, you have to make space for them, not just in your hearts and your mind and cultures, but also physically preoccupied, square miles of land. And it was something where we thought about that, like was coming in, we had to be careful in setting the groundwork for that. But what I wasn't really prepared to was the violence of exit. And I think that it's really, when I think about it, and I'm going to get to your question, but when I think about it, I think about the time that one of our programs, I'm not going to identify which one, particularly rooted for Native Hawaiian students, Kanaka Maoli, for youth, was very broadly providing services, and then they withdrew their services. And I remember an auntie that I had grown up with that I knew from when I was a kid. And they told me this story, and I'll try not to cry when I tell it, but when they closed the program down, she lost a job, 25 years. And then when she finally let out, she went home. She put on her most beautiful muumuu. She put on a gorgeous shell, Niheu shell earrings and necklace. Put her hair beautifully with flowers. And then she walked out into the ocean and she killed herself. In some places you look at it, and she was a service provider, right? Yeah, take a minute. That story always makes me cry, but you can see why I want to tell it, because you guys serve some of those people, right? If you really care, you'll be somebody that walks into those spaces and you'll get hurt if you have to leave them, knowing what can be left behind. But if I could tell her about how she touched me and touched people that I knew, thank you so much. The lives she saved, that she still did good, even if harm happened. So I try to do my very best, but I also try to forgive myself for not being perfect. And ask everybody, forgive yourselves too. You're not going to be, celebrated throughout the world for the work that you're doing necessarily, especially if you do it right and you piss off the right people, right? But I worked for a long time with these communities, and I got an invitation to be there. If you look at, like, I was on Facebook, I ran the social media page, I did a bunch of things and did a lot of resources, and afterwards I talk about the work that I did. But the only video live stream that you saw of me there was the first part when I sang happy birthday to my mother, because I couldn't be there for her birthday. And one of the last ones was towards the end, right before the eviction happened, when I wanted to say a prayer and try to not freak out my family, but we were surrounded by police, and they brought live ammunition. And I just wanted to say goodbye to my family. So those are the few things, but I went there, I didn't go there for personal gain. I didn't go for fame, but part of the things that I'm realizing at this point is that it's really important for me to share these stories, because I wasn't doing it for personal fame. I wasn't doing it for a grant. I wasn't part of like some type of, publication. I'm getting pressured by Dr. Yamada over here to start publishing some of the work that I'm doing, because I just do it because I think it's right. But we need to start sharing some of these stories, because we can't just hear the stories that people write because they're asking for money. We have to start hearing some of these stories because they do things, because you're going to do a million different things because it's right. At least I hope you are. And I think people need to hear those, like Cheryl said, if you don't hear this, that story, like my mom said, if there's a voice out there needs to be heard, be that voice. So try to be that voice. So sorry, that was a long answer, but hopefully I'll be able to answer some other questions. How much more time?
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your story.